So, without further ado, I'll read the letter that I prepared for you. And it's, like I say, I am usually not, this is probably TMI, I'm usually not nervous at all doing these things in front of an audience. But like seeing all these people I know puts me a little bit like, oh, I don't know how they're doing it. But I'm going to read it anyway. So the sort of imaginary setting of this letter, which is, in this case, pretty true, is that I'm writing this letter last night in preparation for the talk today. Actually, I got started on writing the letter about a week ago, but I did finish it off last night, so that part is true. So here we go. Dear Marky, I'm back in Akron again. Tomorrow I'm supposed to speak at the Highland Square branch of the Akron Public Library. They put me on at 11 in the morning. It's a Saturday. I don't think I know anyone who is awake at 11 a.m. on Saturdays. I'm playing a Zero Defects show tonight. I don't even know if I'll be awake at 11. I hope somebody shows up. Being back here in Akron started me thinking about when I first got interested in Zen Buddhism. Did I ever tell you about that? Probably not. I tell the story of how I got into Zen all the time. It's in my first book, Hardcore Zen, and I'm often asked to talk about that book, even though it's now 15 years old. I don't want to tell you the same story I've told the world a couple hundred times. Let me see if there's another way to tell it. In the early 80s, Buddhism in America was nothing like the industry it's become these days, especially in Ohio. You might have been able to find one of the books D.T. Suzuki wrote about Zen in the 1950s at Walden Books in Summit Mall or at the B. Daltons in Rolling Acres. If you were lucky, you might have even stumbled across a copy of Shunryu Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, or one of Alan Watts's books about Zen. Maybe. Way in the back of the store where they keep the books about UFOs and Bigfoot. In those days, you didn't have Lisa Simpson proclaiming herself a Buddhist. The Dalai Lama wasn't appearing on network TV. You didn't see magazines about mindfulness at the checkout stand at the Giant Eagle supermarket. They weren't slapping the word Zen on products ranging from sushi to sleeping aids to pills that claim to help you last all night in bed. I've actually seen those. It's funny. There are people on the internet these days worrying themselves sick over the idea that Buddhism in America is too white. They're upset that the racial demographics at American Zen centers don't match the overall demographics of the country as a whole. This always amuses me because when I started getting into it, the notion that anyone who was not Asian would practice Buddhism was still a novelty. There weren't enough non-Asians into Buddhism that anyone was worried about the racial breakdown of those of us who were. There aren't any statistics available, but my guess would be that there were about 20 or 25 non-Asian Buddhist teachers active in the entire world at the time I met my first Zen teacher. That I, of all people, encountered one of these rare birds never ceases to amaze me. I'll bet every non-Asian Buddhist on earth at the time I first got into Buddhism, not just teachers, but anyone who practiced Buddhism and wasn't Asian, I bet all of them could have fit into the Cleveland Agora with room to spare. Nowadays, they have annual meetings where dozens of American Buddhist teachers of all races gather in fancy hotels and talk about how business is going. Times have changed. And of all the places you'd imagine that someone might encounter a Zen Buddhist teacher in those days, Kent, Ohio would probably not have even made the list. The few Buddhist places in America that welcomed non-Asians at the time were mostly way the heck out in California. There was one in upstate New York and one in Minneapolis, as well as a few others scattered around. But it wouldn't have even occurred to me in those days to make a trip all the way out to California or even to upstate New York just to visit a Zen center. I was a punk, after all. Or at least I played in a punk band, the mighty Zero Defects, who I played with on Friday and who will play a few hours after my talk at the library across the street at Annabelle's, so you can all come to that. Zen was old hippie garbage as far as us punks were concerned. Some of us punks might have had a bit of respect for traditional Zen as practiced in the Far East, but when it came to any American who said he was into Zen, most of us would have laughed in his face. But me, I was secretly into the old hippie garbage. I liked a lot of psychedelic rock from that era, I especially adored the heavy stuff like Blue Cheer and Iron Butterfly. Plus, I had lived in Africa and had been exposed to a bit of Eastern religion there as a child. Kenya, where we lived, had a lot of Indian immigrants. One of my dad's closest friends in those days was Indian. Plus, I loved Indian food, which you could not get in Akron at the time. When I started attending Kent State University in the fall of 1982, I was thinking hard about the meaning of life. I was a philosophy major for a short while, but I was frustrated that KSU only offered classes in Western philosophy. I wanted to know what the deal was with those weird Hindu gods that I saw pictures of at my dad's friend's house. I was into the Beatles too, and they had gone to India to meditate with the Maharishi, but there weren't any classes at KSU about that stuff. I was shouting with zero defects all night last night. Then one semester, I saw a class called Zen Buddhism in the KSU catalog. I had wanted to find something Indian, but I knew that Buddha was from India and that Zen was the Japanese form of an Indian religion. Zen Buddhism was as close as anything KSU offered to what I actually wanted to study, so I signed up. And get this, Marky, that class about Zen Buddhism was a not-for-credit class offered at what KSU called the Experimental College. That was the university's designation for a set of strange classes they weren't quite ready to give college credit for. The KSU Experimental College also offered a class called Intro to Parapsychology, for example. In the early 80s in Ohio, Buddhism was seen as so freaky-deaky you couldn't get academic credit at Kent State for studying it. That's a great example of how the American attitude towards Buddhism has changed. I was so impressed with what I learned in that class that I kept on doing Zazen meditation even after the semester was over. In fact, it ended up becoming the major focus of my life. In those days, I was not in the habit of telling people I meditated and studied Zen. You probably would have laughed at me if I'd told you about it at the time. I don't know if you were even aware of my interest in Zen before my book Hardcore Zen came out in 2004. I don't think we ever discussed it before then. If we did, I don't remember. I wasn't exactly trying to keep my practice a secret. It's just that I didn't want to be one of those people who goes around wearing sandals, stinking of patchouli, and proclaiming that he's into meditation. I never liked those kinds of people. I still don't. And yet I meditated every single day, once in the morning and once at night. There were a few stretches in those early years when I gave up meditating, but I always went back to it after a little while. Days when I did my Zazen were always just a little bit better than days when I didn't. My head didn't feel so fuzzy and buzzy when I did Zazen. When I stopped doing it, the noise and fogginess came back. After a few years, I gave up on giving up Zen. I knew I was stuck with it. But it still wasn't something I defined myself by. I did Zazen every day, but it wasn't the kind of lifestyle bauble that Buddhism seems to be for a lot of folks these days. I know a guy in California who told me that at one point in his life he went surfing every day. He got very good at it, but, he told me, he never considered himself a surfer. A surfer was one of those dudes who bleaches his hair, wears flip-flops, and talks like the guys from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. My friend was never like that. He just really enjoyed surfing. That's kind of how I was with Zen. I didn't want to be known around Akron as Mr. Zen, even though studying and practicing Zen was probably the number one thing in my private life. Lots of other stuff was going on too, though. After the first incarnation of Zero Defects broke up, I sent some tapes of my neo-psychedelic music to a small record label in New York called Midnight Records. They liked what they heard and signed me up. I put out 5 records with that label under the name Dementia 13. When those failed to set the world on fire, I took a job in Takaoka, Japan, teaching English. After a year of pretending to teach English to sleeping Japanese high school students, I got a job with Tsuburaya Productions, the company founded by the man who invented Godzilla. They made a TV show called Ultraman, which I had watched on Channel 43 when I was a kid and really loved. I moved to Tokyo to work for them, and it was in Tokyo that I met another Zen teacher named Gudo Nishijima. After about 7 years of me studying with him, Nishijima Roshi asked me to ordain as a monk and become a certified Zen Buddhist teacher. He said he was willing to do the ceremonies and the paperwork necessary to make it official. Up until he suggested it, I had never given any serious thought to teaching Zen. After all, who was I, a punk rock kid from Ohio, to teach such an ancient, venerable tradition? But Nishijima Roshi talked me into it, and now here I am, back in Akron, to talk to people about my newest book about Zen. These days, Buddhism is everywhere. Mindfulness, a Buddhist practice, don't let anybody tell you different, is being sold to major corporations and schools as the solution to all sorts of problems, such as absenteeism and low productivity. Let me read that sentence again. Is being sold to major corporations and schools as the solution to all sorts of problems such as absenteeism and low productivity. I can't talk today. The word Zen is so hip that I called my third book Zen Wrapped in Karma Dipped in Chocolate after a line in a yogurt commercial. I think I've got a copy over there too. But how many people who talk about Zen are ready to actually do Zen practice? How many of them are willing to devote an hour a day to sitting still and staring at a blank wall? Even though there are lots more folks doing that now than there ever were when I first started out, there still aren't that many. Zen Buddhists do not proselytize. We never try to convert anyone to Zen Buddhism. Zen is a practice you have to take up because you really want to take it up. It's not something someone else can convince you to do. If you're not convinced yourself, then you're not going to put in the effort. Zen is a practice, not a religion. There would be no more sense in trying to convert someone to Zen Buddhism than there would be in trying to, let's say, convert someone into a practitioner of karate or judo. You wouldn't go around knocking on people's doors trying to spread the good news of karate. You just set up a dojo and hope people come to do the practice. I'm not sure what to make of the popularity of Buddhism these days. I suppose it's better than when it was... I suppose it's better... I wrote a weird sentence. I suppose it's better than when it was just something... Let me try it again, sorry. I suppose it's better than when it was just something a few oddballs like me were into. I mean, at least there's an audience for my books, which is nice. But I really don't know how many people go from reading the kind of books on Buddhism that I write to actually doing the practice. Maybe it's about the same as the proportion of people who watch Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee movies and then go on to actually study the martial arts. I have no illusions that I'm going to save the world by bringing people the good news of Zen. But I think maybe there are people out there who would appreciate the philosophy and practice if it was presented in a way that made sense to them. I was lucky enough to find a teacher who could explain Zen in terms that an angry teenage punk rocker could understand. Those old D.T. Suzuki books wouldn't have done it for me. They were too academic, too intellectual. Excuse me. The normal sorts of Zen centers wouldn't have done it for me either, especially the really big ones they have nowadays. I've been to the San Francisco Zen Center a bunch of times. It's a nice place, but the people there these days seem far more interested in being politically correct than in studying Zen. Maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic there, but I really worry that Zen is starting to get lost in some of these places or take a back seat to other concerns. What I want to do is reach the people who are really interested in taking up Zen practice for realsies. My books have enough entertainment value to be engaging to people who just want to get a taste for what Zen is about. and I don't mind at all if people read them without ever getting into Zen practice. But what I'm really hoping to reach is that small proportion of the audience who are going to take it seriously. These generally are not the kinds of people who turn up at parties saying they're into Zen in the hopes that it might make them seem cool. Rather, they're the kinds of people who look at this world and realize that things are desperately screwed up. They're the kind of people that notice that most of the solutions offered by people who say they can fix you up are nonsense. And yet they're the kind who also notice that life is something special. They're not cynical nihilists who want to burn everything down, even though some of them might look like they are. I probably looked like that myself. These are the kinds of people who want to find a way to fully appreciate life as the amazing thing they know it can be. I'm not sure if any of those people will be at the Akron Public Library tomorrow morning, but just in case they are, I want to be there and say a few things to them. And I'm happy to entertain the people who just showed up to hear a good story, too. Wish me luck, Marky. Brad. That end. Sorry. All right, so that's the letter I wrote for the...
In your experience, since you've traveled through Europe and you were in Africa, have you noticed that same trend in the other parts of the world?
Yeah. I think it's the trend of Zen being kind of corporatized, or Buddhism anyway, of all sorts being sort of corporatized and turned into a kind of commodity is, it's all over. And in one sense, it's partially responsible for me having a career. I'm not getting rich off of this, but I've managed to make a living. Some people are getting rich off of it. Sometimes I wonder how they manage, but I can pay my rent doing what I'm doing, which is nice. And part of the reason I can pay my rent doing what I'm doing is because it's become trendy and people are looking to Buddhism as like I said, the thing to help fix their problems. And I go to places all the time. There's one place in Germany that invites me every year, and I really like this place. They're real nice people, but I can see it's a large meditation center in Bavaria. It's far away from any city, but it's an old Benedictine monastery that they've turned into a meditation center. But I can see that the way they're making their money is by selling Zen to Germans who are interested in using it in exactly the way that I sort of resent it being used. But that's what keeps them in business, and they are serious people about meditation, but they know how to pitch it to that mindset and get the money, and that keeps their thing functioning, which I can't really resent that, because in a sense, in order to survive, Buddhist temples have always had some sort of side business that they do. Often the martial arts has been involved in it, sometimes doing sort of ceremonial things for the community. That's been a thing that they do. In the Middle Ages, it's slightly a kind of a dark part of Zen history, but the samurai were interested in the way Zen training could give them an edge in fighting. Because if you're very centered and your enemy is not very centered, you can slice him up with the sword really easy because they're distracted and you're not. You just, so it was used that way in the Middle Ages in Japan. And this sort of corporate mindfulness, it's not obviously quite as violent as that, but I think it's kind of a manifestation of the same thing. It's trying to use this practice, and it can make you better at business. That's true. It's not really supposed to be used that way, but if you're a business person and you're going into your negotiations being very centered and not distracted by other things, you're going to have an edge on your competition, and I can't argue with that, as a proposition. That's going to happen. And I don't know, I have mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand, it's one way that when you I always feel like if you present something like that to 1,000 people, let's just pick a number arbitrarily out of the air, there's going to be 6 people in that group who are going to hear what you're saying and go, oh my God, this is it. And the other 9,000 or 900, and I can't do the math, it's just going to go over their heads. But that's one way to reach those people, those rare people who are going to take it seriously. And so there's a good thing to that. The downside is that people get very confused. One of the other things slightly tangential to the question you asked is this revival of interest in psychedelic drugs, which was something I tried before I did Zen myself for the same reasons that people are doing it these days. And spoiler alert, it doesn't work. But it can be very exciting. That's come into Zen as well, through the back door, or through Buddhism in the back door, and then you got the mindfulness courses that people are doing in corporations, and it probably the people who do that, they get some good out of it, and so okay. But I do think it's often missing the point. And I suppose the point that it's usually missing, and usually every time Buddhism is translated into something else, the thing that they miss is the ethical teachings. And it's become weird because there are actually books, and you can go online and you can read people who seem to be authoritative saying that Zen in particular usually, or sometimes Buddhism as a whole, has no ethical teachings or doesn't worry about morality or something like that. And I go, what the hell? What are you talking about? It's all over. It's one of the strongest foundational things in all of this teaching is this very ethical idea that goes with the 10 Buddhist precepts in Zen, which are a bit like the 10 Commandments. But it's very strongly emphasized, and I think a lot of that's important because there's a certain, well, it goes along with what I was telling you earlier, that you can develop certain abilities through a focused Zen practice or other meditation practices that can give you some powers. Not like powers to levitate things like Yoda in Star Wars or anything like that. At least that hasn't happened for me yet. At least I don't tell you about it. But the power to... One of the things you'll develop if you do a meditation practice is, almost everybody gets this to a certain extent, is a power to kind of learn how to manipulate people. I mean, you don't learn how to, you could use it that way, but you realize that all of us are fundamentally the same. I mean, you can say that and everybody knows that, but if you do a deep meditation practice, you get very deeply into it and you realize that the level at which we are very much alike, every human being on earth, is very profound and very deep. And if you want to, you could use that to manipulate somebody, to really have an influence over somebody and to take advantage. And it happens more frequently than I'd like to admit. I mean, a lot of these, if you've heard of some of the sex scandals that sometimes go on, that rage, like little wildfires throughout the Buddhist world every few years, nobody talks about it, but I think a lot of that is people who discover their ability to manipulate others, particularly in the sexual stuff, and you find you can just reach somebody and they don't even know you're doing it, and suddenly, they're ready to do anything, and I think that's happening quite often, and the reason we have these ethical teachings is because that was understood 2,000 years ago when people first started, 2,500 years ago when people first started doing this practice. It became apparent that there were certain things that came with it, and that you had to have, if you were going to practice Zen, you had to have an ethical foundation. You had to. And the martial arts teachers do the same thing. You know, good martial arts teachers do the same thing. They understand that you have to have a certain ethical stance or ethical foundation before you do these practices, because they're dangerous otherwise. That's the thing that worries me a little bit when I see it being kind of, you know, take a class in mindfulness, you know, and I'm going, oh, you know, you're just turning mindfulness, you know, loose on all these people, and they don't know where it's going to lead. But people who are experienced in it kind of know where it could lead. So, yeah. Thank you.
And that's why I worry about corporations using it, because they manipulate behavior for profit only. For sure, and the thing is, it can work. You know, that's what makes it even more dangerous. Is that I think there'll probably be, you know, a corporation that gets its employees to meditate is probably going to be more successful than one that doesn't. You know, and that could be good, but it could also be bad. You know, if they don't know what they're getting into.
Why did you use a different name for your friend?
Ooh, how much do I want to get into that? Well, I can give you the unofficial version in private later if you want. But the official version is not untrue. It's just leaving out certain details. But the official version is basically that I have written books before which used elements of my own life in them, particularly the one I mentioned, Zen Wrapped in Karma Dipped in Chocolate, uses a lot of elements of my real life at the time that I wrote the book. And that I wrote in 2007, and there's been a certain amount of fallout from that. Nothing I couldn't handle, but for example, people who at the time said, okay, use my real name in the book, and it's okay for you to put these details of what happened between us in the book. And then a few years later, they call me up and go, "Oh God, I wish you hadn't written that book." And you know, because somebody asked me about it the other day. You know, I've had that happen. Or you know, one person who's mentioned in that book has told me that people have talked to her and gone, "Oh, you're the one from Brad Warner's book," and she doesn't like being the one from Brad Warner's book, even though she's mentioned in it. So there's a bit of that, and I didn't want to do that again with the people that might have known the actual people who died in my life, and it also made it. I first wrote when I first got the idea. I did write it to one of the specific people who had died using his real name and everything, and it got a little bit emotional for me, you know, and. Using a different name for him kind of made it easier to get around that. You know, somehow that little change, even though I knew who I was thinking about in my mind, by typing another name and sort of picturing another person, because in the book I create a kind of fictional backstory for this person, which is mostly based on the two people that I'm mainly thinking of who died, and also some other people I know are all mixed together into this one sort of character, and so I can picture that character, and it made it a little easier to write that way, and then to be specific. Yeah. But that's it. Yeah, that's the official reason. Sure.
What's the difference between Zen and Taoism?
Oh, the difference between Zen and Taoism is pretty great, depending on who you ask. So, if you read sort of introductory textbooks like on world religions, one of the things they will often tell you as a shorthand for explaining Zen in Buddhist context is saying that Buddhism was an Indian religion, and it became quite popular in India. And when it moved into China, it became mixed with Taoism, and that is the foundations of Zen. And I think, as a sort of shorthand explanation, I guess that's okay, but it's not. I don't think it's really true. And the best way I can give as an example of why that confusion is there, it would be like saying that Zen, in order to make itself understood by Americans became mixed with Christianity. And there is a sense of that happening these days, because people who talk about Zen, or talk about Buddhism in general, but let's say about Zen, the Zen form specifically, are forced to use Christian terms. Like I wrote a book called There Is No God and He Is Always With You, about the concept of God and how the concept of God works into the Buddhist framework, because if you read Buddhism, it's very easy to think that Buddhism is a religion in which there is zero concept of God. I would argue that that's not quite true. There isn't a concept in Buddhism of an old man with a beard who sits on the throne and judges you after you die kind of God. But in Buddhism there is a sense of there being some sort of overall intelligence that pervades the universe, that the universe is not a dead thing, that it's a living thing, and that we were all part of a living thing. And in some ways that's very much analogous to a different sort of concept of God. So as far as Taoism is concerned, when Buddhism started getting translated into Chinese, the word that they used for the Buddhist way is Tao. So they would use the word Tao, and they used certain other linguistic concepts from Taoism to make Buddhism understood, and the Zen people were probably the ones who did it the most. And a lot of the costuming changed, because the Taoist monks liked to wear black, and the Buddhist monks in India would wear, because you've probably seen some of the Nepalese and Burmese and other Indian Buddhist monks sometimes around who wear the orange stuff, and that's what they wore in India. And when it got to China, the Chinese really weren't into those orange things, so they wore black robes. They wore the Taoist robes. And they started picking up certain other aspects of the Taoist stuff, but philosophically, stylistically, the Zen people took from Tao a little bit in the sense of Indian philosophy is very, very wordy. I don't know if anybody's ever studied Indian philosophy, but it's incredibly wordy, and the Indian culture seems to favor explanations on top of explanations on top of other explanations, and just making these giant treatises on things. And that's what Buddhism was sort of doing in India. When it came to China, everything got shortened. They tried to shorten it down to like a single sentence, and that was, I think, an influence of Taoism, because the Taoists did that too. So instead of giving these long, boring stories with the different permutations and different philosophers adding their 2 cents in and whatever, the Zen people truncated everything down to very short sort of aphorisms, which I think, which is real nice for me, because I never could get into reading those long stories, the long Indian stories, and I much prefer the Chinese and Japanese stuff. The Japanese kind of picked up on that, of making it very short, which has the nice sort of result of that is, if you study Zen, you don't really have to be that smart, which I like. You don't have to be like a scholar, really. You can be, and there are plenty of Zen scholars out there, but I'm not one of them. And I like the fact that a lot of it's very short and to the point. Dogen is probably, that Bob mentioned earlier, is probably an exception to that rule, because Dogen wrote huge long things, but he also wrote very short things in the Chinese style, which are easier to get through. But actually I find that Dogen's longer pieces are often better for me, because he'll go into more detail, and you go, oh, that's what you meant when you said this one sentence, and it helps. But yeah, I never really, I read the Tao Te Ching, the main book of Taoism, at one point in my life, but I never really studied it. Dogen himself he goes on a little rant in his book Shobo Genzo about why Buddhism is not Taoism, and and that sort of influenced the way I answer that particular question, because I know Dogen, you know, if he's up there in Buddhist heaven looking down on me, he'd get pissed if I said it was like Taoism, even though in some ways it is like Taoism, but you know, there is that kind of sense. I think they influenced each other in a way. I think contemporary Taoism is just as influenced by Buddhism as the Buddhists are influenced by Taoists at this point. And also in China, I can speak. I lived in Japan for 11 years, so I can speak about Japanese culture without much fear of being wrong. But I think this is sort of common to Chinese culture as well. Is the sense of we Americans tend to like to know what religion we are. You know, like, I am Jewish. You know, I'm not Jewish, but you know, they're like, you know, I am Catholic. You know, I am Lutheran, and they're definitely Lutheran, and they're not anything else. Japanese people aren't like that. They're usually they go. Religion is kind of thought of in practical terms. So happy, joyful ceremonies in Japan are always handled by the Shinto people. Shinto is the native Japanese religion, which predates Buddhism in coming into Japan, and so they get all the happy, you know, coming of age ceremonies and nice things like that, and the spring, you know, coming of spring ceremonies and all this. And then when it comes to death and sickness and horrible things nobody wants to deal with, that's the Buddhists. So if you're Japanese, you go to the Buddhists to deal with death and illness and sadness. And lately, if you want to have a wedding, you go to the Christians. That's become a trend in the last 30 or so years in Japan, that the Christian weddings are big. And hardly anybody in Japan is a Christian, but you know, most of people who are married these days go to a Christian church for the wedding, because I don't know, that's where you go for a wedding. So I think in that sense, probably the Chinese culture they don't really make those hard distinctions, and I know Japanese doesn't make that hard distinction between different religions. So they freely mix everything up, and nobody seems to be too fussed about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm from India.
Okay.
I came into this country, say, about 40 years ago.
Okay.
And, well, I was appalled too, because I didn't know anything about non-Asians promoting Buddhism.
Yeah, must be
yoga,
weird, yeah.
Or for what. But believe me, if they hadn't started this, I wouldn't have learned further.
Really?
I didn't learn much in India.
That's interesting, yeah.
But you know, I am very grateful for non-Asians starting this movement, say Caucasians or anybody, even some Japanese. But I am grateful that they started teachings of Buddha or whatever for that matter, anything Asian.
It is really interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I noticed, like, I've said this, like, after living in Japan, the average American who has studied Buddhism probably knows more about Buddhism than most Japanese people do. You know, somebody like me, I would tell my Japanese friends stuff about Buddhism that they didn't know, you know, which I thought was funny, you know.
Yeah,
like,
that's what I said, yes. But they do know a lot, so I'm all praise for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think it's just the natural course of things. You know, these philosophy. If it's a good philosophy, it will appeal to people outside of the place where it, you know, was born. You know, and I think that's why Buddhism appeals to people, and it crosses all sorts of boundaries. You know, and all of these things like yoga and some of the Vedanta and things like that. They're good philosophies, and they appeal to people, and it's great. It's great that there are Indian people in Akron. Really, because I was serious. I used to love Indian food, and then we had it in Kenya, and then we came back to Akron. I'm like, where you can't get a samosa anywhere, but now you can.
Now you can. And if I knew, I would have brought some.
Oh, great! Thank you. Okay, sure.
Okay. You have a very interesting eclectic background. What were some of your other interests earlier when you were growing up?
Oh, yeah, nobody asks that. Well, I'll tell you, probably the first place that Buddhism planted any sort of seed in me was science fiction, particularly Philip K. Dick, the novelist. I loved Philip K. Dick's novels, and during high school, like, they were all out of print, and I had to search all over the place to get copies, but I managed to read almost all of his novels when I was still in high school. And he had a lot of interest. I don't think he ever practiced any sort of Buddhism, but he had a lot of interest in it, and he would stick things in his books. So that was there, and science fiction in general was a huge interest. And then the punk rock thing. One of the things I wrote in Hardcore Zen was about the weird intersection between punk rock and Zen, which I don't think either side knew that they had. The sort of punk rock scene that I got into in Akron in the early '80s was very much influenced by what came out of Washington, D.C., which was sort of punk rock with a very ethical stance that they took. So they were really interested in, there was this straight edge movement of not doing drugs or drinking or having illicit sex and all this stuff, and it almost sounds like trying to follow the Buddhist precepts. That was, not everybody practiced it, but people sort of knew the band I was in as Zero Defects as a straight edge band, but I think I was the only one who was sort of straight edge at the time. And I was only really straight edge, in that I didn't like getting drunk and I didn't know how to have illicit sex. I didn't know how to approach women, so I was so that was out for me too. But I thought that was a good sort of ethic, and that was in there too, And I was always there's no musicians in my family, but I got interested in music at an early age, and I don't know why. It's kind of weird. A lot of people who get into music as heavily as I did have like somebody they can point to, like a relative or an influence. I just really I heard this stuff, and I'm like, okay, and I had a friend who could play guitar. I'm like, oh, okay, show me how to do that, and I got really deeply involved in music, which is why I made those records and things. And I had hoped at the time for a career in music. I gave it a 10-year run of trying to make a career out of it, and I got far enough that I had albums out on a label that was getting distributed worldwide. 3,000 copies, I think, is all that any Dementia 13 album ever sold, but that was more than nothing, so that was nice. And then later on, I heard that Yoko Ono's albums sold about 3,000 copies each. I'm like, wow, I'm right up there with Yoko Ono. I remember hearing that and going, oh, Yoko only sells 3,000, so that's all right. So yeah, that was in there, and I'm still a big science fiction nerd. There's a friend of mine in Japan who wants us to write a movie together, a science fiction movie that he hopes. He's a director, and he's directed some fairly not blockbuster movies, but movies that got distribution and had serious attention. And so I don't know. I've been working on that for a few months now, trying to write a science fiction movie for my friend in Japan. So I've always got a few other things going on like that. And I've been in movies. That's another thing I enjoy telling people about. If you go up on the internet, I have a friend named Piruz Kalea who makes these weird films, and my favorite of his movies is called Zombie Bounty Hunter MD, and he cast me in that as basically myself. And the plot of the movie is these people who are sort of YouTubers who make their living making YouTube videos. They stumble upon a zombie invasion where people are getting killed and eaten by zombies, and instead of trying to help these people or do anything, they video it and put it on YouTube, and they're trying to get hits, and make money off of it. And then they co-opt me into so I have a different, I'm called Brad in the movie, but they don't give my last name. but I'm a guy who writes Buddhist books and things, so they get me to try to make their thing seem legitimate. Like I'm going to make them, and I'm perfectly willing to do this because I want to make money too. That's my character, who is my sort of parody of what I think a lot of people in the business I'm in would do if given the chance. I don't know if they would watch people getting killed and just stand by while it happens and not do anything so they could make money. But it's sort of a satire of what I think a lot of people do in the kind of world of commercial meditation. So I do that too. Yeah. So if a Zombie Bounty Hunter MD is on. It's all on YouTube, and he cut it up into like 10 parts. So you have to watch. You have to click each part one after another. But it's all on the internet if you want to see that.
I wanted to ask.
I saw him first, so I'm not trying to be okay.
I wanted to ask you about the intersection of your Zen practice with your creative and musical pursuits. And something you just recently wrote in your blog brought this into focus, your milkshake blog.
Oh, yeah.
And how do you separate, or how do you define the difference between pursuing those things and chasing them, or hooking into the desire to create the music? It's a problem I've had between my practice and creativity.
Yeah.
And how much you're flogging your ego and how much you're...
It's hard to say, how much your ego is going into the creation of a piece of music or, a piece of art, and how much is genuine creativity. Like just in general, that's sometimes hard to make the distinction. This is going to sound like a sort of cop-out answer maybe, but my sort of way of dealing with this is I just don't worry about it anymore. I used to be concerned about that stuff, and now I kind of just do what I enjoy doing and just let that guide me. My teacher, Nishijima Roshi, was good for that, and Tim McCarthy too was good for that, because they kind of say, you pursuing what feels right is sometimes the best way, and I think that's true. You just kind of do what you do, and that there might be a certain amount of ego in it is sort of that's just going to happen. There's a certain amount of ego that goes into even just normal meditation practice. Most of us who do it, and I count myself as one of these, wanted something. We wanted something. I don't know exactly what I wanted. I wanted my brain to be a little less fuzzy, and I was very concerned about the nature of life and the universe, and I thought, well, maybe I can figure it out, So there was that pursuit, not the purest thing I suppose one could have, and so I just kind of let it be there, because you're never gonna. In that blog, I did something that I don't normally do, which is I used the standard version of the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. The cutting off desire is the way to cut off suffering, and the Eightfold Path is the way to cut off desire, I think is the usual formulation. My teacher hated that formulation, and he had another way of putting it. So, but what he would also say, and one of the reasons he didn't like that formulation, is he would say it's impossible to cut off desire. If you put it that way, you're just asking people to do the impossible, which you're always going to desire something. Even if it's something basic as the desire to breathe or eat, you're going to have a desire there. But all of us have desires beyond that too. And so I just let it be, and I can write these books. There are some times when I feel a little hint of something. This is a story I told on my blog, so I'll just tell it here. Although I kind of wonder why I put this out publicly to begin with. But right after Nishijima Roshi died, he died in I think 2012. It's weird. You'd think I would know the date when my teacher died very significantly. But he'd kind of withdrawn for maybe 2 years before he died. So I lost total contact with him, and then like 2 years later, I got the message that he died, and I'm like, oh, well, I wonder what happened in those 2 years, and I still don't really know. He just decided he didn't want to keep in contact with people, I suppose. But right after he died, but before I got the word that he died, I had a dream in which Nishijima Roshi is talking to me, and he's saying, you know, you're scattering your stuff too much. You really need to focus. You know, you really need to focus on the Zen thing if you want to do it right, and you shouldn't be doing all these other things. And so every once in a while I remember that. And I don't, you know, I am skeptical of anything that comes under the heading of psychic phenomenon. I say skeptical because I don't completely reject it, but I also think it's so easy to get fooled in those areas that I'm reluctant to think that my teacher himself appeared to me in a dream. But the timing of it is such that, you know, it's really weird that I had this dream after he died, but before I heard that he died. So I do think about that, and I sort of try to make everything into a practice somehow. You know, even playing with zero defects, I kind of look at that as a sort of practice, and it's a kind of a funny sort of practice. But I try, you know, when we're playing, I try to get completely into that, you know, and leave everything else out of it, and just try to really, really focus on doing a damn good zero defects show, you know, because I think that's the sort of Zen way to do a zero defects show, you know, is to just go, you know, right into it. And I think actually the other guys in the band do the same thing, but you know, they don't have that same reason for doing it, I suppose. But it's one of the things that makes us a great band. So. Yeah. And you had a question?
I do, yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you lost a close friend of yours and lost your teacher, and sorry to hear that. So I'm curious, how do you feel that like following Zen practices for many years has changed the way that you confront and like cope with the death process?
Yeah, that's a good question, and also a hard one. This current book is about that, and the other one that I mentioned, Zen Wrapped in Karma, Dipped in Chocolate, is about when my mother and my grandmother both died in the same year, within a few months of each other. One at the beginning of the year and one at the end of the year, and that knocked me for a loop, because I also split up from my then wife at that same year, and lost my job with Tsuburaya Productions the same year. So it all happened, and I was already into this thing. I wasn't touring internationally, because this is 2007, so I was touring, but I was doing a lot of stuff around America. So I would just load up my car with some books in the back and travel to a place and do talks and lead retreats and stuff. And I was going all over the place, and I was doing that while my mom and my grandmother were dying, same as I was doing the tour of Europe as my friend was dying. So I was in the midst of it. So I'm actually required to come out. You know, the day that this friend of mine died, no, the following day, because I did have a day off the day I heard he died, but the following day I had to go give a talk in Hamburg about Zen. You know, right after this, you know, I got the news that my friend died, and that's in this book. I wrote about that, although I changed it from Hamburg to a different city, because I was worried I would offend these people, because it was kind of a crummy gig for me. I mean, just for the obvious reasons, and also because the people I was talking to seemed a little bit oblivious. You know, I was trying to tell them what happened to me in my personal life, and they seemed completely oblivious to that. And they were like, "What do you think of Dogen's meaning of being in time?" And I'm like, "Screw being in time! My friend has died!" And you know, so you don't. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it does help. Like you know, as a practical thing, when my mom died, my dad went to pieces, which is understandable, and my sister kind of did too, and I ended up being at my dad's house. He lived in the suburbs of Dallas at the time, and I had to do all we did a cremation. I had to do all the cremation arrangements, and I could do it because I had this sort of thing to draw on. Because when you're doing zazen is a very simple practice. So it's called just sitting in Japanese, shikantaza. And that's what you're doing. You're not trying to focus, you're not trying to be mindful, you're not trying to do anything. This is the hardest part for a lot of people when they practice, is the idea of you're not trying to do anything but just sit still. And don't even worry about what you're going to learn from this or get enlightened about it or how you're going to have a takeaway. Just try to sit still for 30 minutes and do nothing else but sit still. And that sounds like it might be easy, but it's not. If you're trying to just fully immerse yourself in the practice of sitting still. And so I'd done that for years, and a lot of stuff comes up when you try to sit still, because it's almost like your mind is in there like a little kid going, "Hey, look at me," and if the easy stuff, doesn't work and isn't getting your attention. It's like I was just visiting my friend who has a kitten yesterday, and if anybody had a kitten, you know how kittens are. They'll try they'll nip at your toe, and if that doesn't work, pretty soon they're scratching your face off and everything else, trying to get your attention. And that's what the mind does when you're sitting zazen. So I had done it enough of just sitting there in a either at home or in a temple somewhere, with my mind raging out of control and throwing up all sorts of stuff. It's like you're I didn't know that I remembered my toilet training. And it's all there, and all this stuff is in there, and this thing that guy said to me in 7th grade. It's there again. And anything that's the worst fantasy you ever had about doing the most unsavory thing, suddenly that's up there, and you're going, "Oh my God, I can't believe I even thought of that." So I'd had that experience, and so just everybody's sort of freaking out, and my mom being dead and having to get everything worked up so that we could get her cremated. They lost her body. I mean, that was the craziest part of that day, is nobody knew where my mom's body was for about 2 full days, and I kept making these calls, well, we're not sure. We think it was shipped to, Jesus Christ, that's my mom, Yeah, well, we're looking for her. She's in the inventory, And the box they sent us, they were like, with her in it. We never opened it up because we're like, I don't think we want to open this up. But sometimes I think about it and I wonder if that was even her. They might have sent us somebody else for all we know. We might have done a cremation ceremony for some stranger for all I know. They send you the body in what looks like a pizza box, like a gigantic pizza box. This cardboard box, and because I guess that burns really well in the crematorium. But yeah, my gosh. So that helped, and just kind of, I was with this one friend who's the main person I'm writing about in the book. I spent 2 different weeks with him. I don't know if it was a full week or more like 5 or some days, but I went and visited him 2 times after he'd gotten diagnosed with cancer. One of those times, I had already planned to go hang out with him, and he didn't even know then. And then he got the call from his doctor, and and he was like, "Well, don't cancel the trip. I still feel fine." So I went and hung out with him, and he knew, the prognosis at that point was not good, but it could have gone either way. And then I don't know how many months later, I went and visited him again, and by then the prognosis was looking really bad. Although he was still in good spirits and in decent shape. He could still hang out and do stuff. He wasn't bedridden or anything like that. But his doctors were telling him that it's progressing and there's nothing we can do about it. And and having had that practice behind me, I don't think I could have gotten through that. I don't know, maybe somebody else could have gotten through that without this practice. I couldn't have, you know. I needed to kind of keep reminding myself of how to kind of, you know, with emotional stuff in Zen, it's not a matter of trying to not have any emotional response. It's a matter of trying to allow an emotional response to come up and not necessarily do anything about it. So I would have these emotional responses come up when I'm sitting next to my friend watching a documentary about Bob Guccione. That's one of the things we did when we were hanging out. Oh God, and this is in the book. One of the things he said to me was, I just thought it was so indicative of his sense of humor. Near the end of the documentary, he said, Bob Guccione died of cancer when he was 83 years old. And my friend sitting next to me on the couch going, that's not dying of cancer when you die when you're 83. Because he was 48 at the time, you know, so. I was like, yeah. Yeah, you're right. That's not real dying of cancer. But yeah. So getting through that, it was useful, you know. It sort of helped kind of keep everything even.
Like compartmentalized.
Yeah, compartmentalized, or just kind of allowing it to be, and not necessarily trying to avoid it, but allowing it to have its own sort of space in my psyche without worrying about it. And you know, there's all sorts of people sometimes wonder about reincarnation and some of this stuff in the Buddhism about what happens after you die. And I think most people in the Zen tradition tend to be a bit skeptical about that. And it's one of the points of contention that happens sometimes between Zen people and other forms of Buddhism, is they'll insist there is absolutely reincarnation is absolutely a real thing, and the Zen people will go, yeah, maybe it's a real thing. You know, I don't know. But I do have a sense that in some form my mother is still around, and in some form these friends of mine who died are still around. But I don't like to speculate too much on what that is. You know, I don't know enough to say. But I do feel that what we are doesn't exit the universe as soon as we plop over dead. I think it sort of stays within the realm of things, but in a different form. And so you know, when I think about that, I try not to think too much about that, because I realize that when you start thinking about things like that, you very quickly end up in random speculation, you know, and at that point you could randomly speculate about anything, so why worry about it? Oh.
How important do you think it is to have a teacher if you're studying Buddhism or Zen, or have a community of people you do it with?
Yeah.
I'm uncomfortable with that so far, but
it's a question I get a lot. That's why I'm smiling, that the idea of how important it is to have a teacher or a community to practice. There's a thing Dogen wrote called Gakudo Yojinshu, which doesn't matter, it's just a bunch of Japanese, but it's sort of, I think that translates to sort of like points in studying the way, something like that. That's probably wrong, but anyway, it's the bits of advice that he gives for people who want to study Zen. And one of the things he is very emphatic about is you need a teacher. Dogen just says that in no uncertain terms. And I was lucky enough that I found two teachers that I liked. I was not very fond. Actually, Tim's little community in Kent was fine. I liked all those people. Nishijima Roshi's community in Tokyo, there were some people in there who I thought were a nightmare, and one of them is still a nightmare for me on the internet sometimes. And if any of you follow Facebook, you may have seen some of this stuff from that guy. because he's very active on Facebook. So I liked Nishijima, but I didn't. Some of his community I did like, and they're still good friends of mine. But there were certain people in there that I was just like, oh my God, I don't want to. I would almost not go because they would be like, oh, those guys are going to be there, and I don't want to have anything to do with these people. So I'm aware that it can be a thing, and that finding a teacher you like, I consider myself super lucky. You know, that's one of the great mysteries of my trajectory in this practice, that I happen to just, you know, almost literally bump into Tim McCarthy, who's still active out in Kent if anybody wants to go sit with him. I'm going to go there tomorrow morning at 11 and sit with him. But he was very easy to relate to. He wasn't a very standard sort of Zen teacher material. And I always say that if Zen had come to me, if what I had, if for example my first introduction to Zen had been going to the San Francisco Zen Center and meeting some of the teachers there, especially some of the famous ones, I wouldn't have stuck with it. I would have been like, yeah, you guys are full of, you know, baloney, and I don't want to hang around with you. I'm sure that would have been my reaction, especially at 19 or 20 when I started doing this. I would have been, appalled by it, as I sometimes am even now. I don't want to say too much. I don't want to talk trash about San Francisco Zen Center, because I think overall they're a good place, but there's some stuff going on there. So I understand that it can be difficult, and I suppose my advice for people who aren't lucky enough, as I was, to find a teacher right off the bat that they actually, you know, can relate to, who actually works for them, is, you know, just sit with groups here and there and see what feels right. Because even Dogen did that. If you read his little autobiographical sections that he peppers throughout his writings, you can put together a trajectory of him going to this teacher and being, maybe not, and going to this teacher. And there's like, he mentions about maybe 10 different teachers, I'm not sure, who he stayed with for a short time and then eventually left, until he found this teacher named Tendo Nyojo. That's his pronunciation in Japanese. It's not, he's a Chinese guy and he pronounced his own name differently, but that's a whole, doesn't matter. Anyway, until he found Tendo Nyojo, there was a lot of different teachers in his life who he practiced with for short periods. And then he found this teacher that they got each other, and that's when he finally, I mean, Dogen seems to have been given permission by other teachers to teach and then refused it. He doesn't say so specifically in his writings, but reading between the lines, it sure sounds like a couple of teachers, maybe 3 different teachers, had offered him to become a teacher of Zen, and then he just didn't, until he found a guy who really resonated with him, and then that guy also offered, and then Dogen took on the mantle and became a teacher himself. And so that might be what you have to do. And also the idea of having a teacher, if you think about what it was like in ancient times, you know, there wasn't mass communication. There weren't even telephones or telegraphs, and even writing letters was iffy, because you didn't know if your letter would actually make it, because it might be, you know, the courier might be attacked by bandits or something. So having close contact with a teacher wasn't always something people could do. So when you hear about somebody who 500 or 1,000 years ago had a teacher, often it meant that they met that guy a handful of times in their entire life, you know, or maybe once in some cases, but it just worked, and so sometimes that's what you do, you know. So it doesn't mean that having a teacher doesn't necessarily mean you have to go, you know, live with the guy and spend every day, you know, studying. But I think it is important. I think the usefulness of it is having something to bounce off of. There's a cautionary tale. I think I put it in my book, Sit Down and Shut Up, but it came up for me. If you guys, I don't know how much of news this made in America, but I was in Japan at the time. I was in Tokyo at the time of the Aum Shinrikyo subway attacks, when this cult put poison gas on the Tokyo subway systems in rush hour one morning, in an attempt to, I don't know, I think they thought they were going to start the apocalypse, but the poison actually did kill several people and injured like hundreds of people. Still have lingering effects from this poison gas they put on the subway systems. I was in Tokyo that day. I was traveling on the Tokyo Metropolitan Rail System that day, not on any of the lines that got gas attacked, but I had traveled from home to the office the day that happened. And I knew those stations, Kasumigaseki Station and some of these stations got attacked. I mean, those were places I went. They weren't like somewhere far away. That's where you go if you want to get the sandwich over there or whatever. That's what they were to me. And so that was real close to home. The guy who did that, the guy who inspired those attacks, was a guy who meditated a lot, also did a lot of LSD, and never had a teacher. And there's this weird story that came up in the newspaper about, like, the Om Shinrikyo people. I mean, there was a core group who poisoned the subway, and they were clearly insane. But it was a large organization filled mostly with people who were sincere spiritual seekers. They weren't crazy people. They just got involved in this thing. So after this gas attack came out, a lot of those people were looking for something, and several of them ended up studying with this one particular Zen teacher who happened to live in the area where they had their main concentration. And there was a story about him in one of the newspapers, one of the Japanese newspapers, at the time this happened, like a month or 3 months after it happened. And one of the things he said was, this Zen teacher said, was they would tell him stories that they'd heard of Shoko Asahara, that was the leader of the group's different revelations that he'd had during meditations, and these people would tell him that. And this guy who's a Zen teacher would be like, yeah, I had those revelations too, but my teachers always told me, forget about that and keep sitting. Don't get excited about that experience that you had during meditation, because the real meat of the practice is just sitting. Well, the guy Shoko Asahara never had anybody to tell him that. So he would meditate and he'd have these fantastic experiences, and he'd go, oh, I found the secret, and then he'd kind of come out to the people and go, look, I found the secret, and then it's la-di-da-di-da, whatever it was. So that's a rather extreme example, and most people aren't going to go that direction with it. But it does happen that if you meditate alone, and your first few years of meditation are probably mostly going to be boring. That's just the way it goes, and often people give up because it's so damn boring. But after a while, almost everybody starts to have these kind of weird, almost psychedelic experiences around their meditation practice. Not everybody. Some people get lucky and don't have them. But when that sort of thing happens, it's really useful to be able to talk to somebody about it. And most of your friends, not your particular, but most of our normal friends, they don't know anything about that. And so, when some of that freaky stuff started happening to me, it was really useful to be able to talk to this, elderly Japanese man who would listen to my freaked out stories of cosmic awareness and go, oh yeah, sometimes that happens, don't worry about it, it'll go away, and I'm going, but I saw the whole universe doing a thing, and yeah, we all see the whole universe doing a thing, it's just, you get through it and then you go make breakfast and it's fine. So yeah, so and it was good to have that attitude towards it. I don't know personally how it would have gone for me if I'd had experiences like that and didn't have somebody who had a very grounded attitude towards those things. I don't know if I'd have gone off the deep end. Probably my inclination would be to think I was going insane and to check myself into a mental hospital or something. But I didn't do that, and I didn't become a cult leader, not yet. So I count myself lucky for having a teacher and having a group around me and having people who'd had experiences similar to that, who could be like, okay, that was useful. Did you have something you wanted to say? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I was
away from
going to make a quick comment, but then I do have a question. The comment I was going to make was that, and you should say something about it too, I guess, but is that when you were talking about, she was talking about teachings coming to the West and kind of keeping those teachings alive. Isn't that kind of like almost become part of the narrative of Tibetan Buddhism, that because of Tibet, it's like theoretically it can get wiped out because of China, that their teachers, they've actually sent people to the West?
I think that's how Trungpa ended up.
To keep that going, right, Anyway, you used a phrase, just by chance, I mean, just in part of one of your answers earlier, and it just sort of struck me, I just thought it was interesting. This is either a really simple question or a really complicated one.
Okay, let's see.
But I'll just ask it anyway. So, does Zen practice solve your problems?
No. I mean, that's a short answer. I'm always, when people, and that's a good question. People will frame that, and usually when they ask me that, they'll have a specific problem they want to solve, and they'll tell me all about it. And I'm used to getting these emails that are like, 12 paragraphs long of somebody's, thing that they want to solve, and then and then asking me what Zen can do for them. And usually I feel like I don't want to make promises that it can do anything, really, and not because it can't do anything, but because if you're expecting it to do something for you, that's how you destroy any chance of it doing anything for you, ironically. So the best thing to do with Zen practice is come to it with no expectations. I mean, but to be, sort of honest, it solved some of my initial problems. Like I said, I don't know if I was 19 or 20 when I first encountered Tim, but it was in those years, and that's a turbulent time in anybody's life, and it was for me. And and all sorts of stuff was going on that was very difficult to process. And the first problem that Zen solved was just an overabundance of thoughts in my head. I mean, it didn't erase my mind and become the perfect void or anything like that, but it became easier to just let a thought go without, just thoughts will often come in the form of a problem that you must solve. Like, here's the thing you must solve, and then you're, before you know it, you're sitting there going, I can't solve this, and you're, and the Zen practice kind of got me to understand that I can just let those thoughts pass and not solve them. And that was a great weight lifted off, because I can just be like, biggest problem in the world, don't have to do anything about it, I'll do something about it, but I don't have to figure it out right now. Dealing with certain troubling aspects of life and stuff, that's been useful. But I don't know, if you go into it expecting to have a particular problem solved, you'll probably be disappointed. It doesn't really work that way. It's not for solving problems. What it's for is very difficult to say. I mean, I think what it's for is to solve a kind of bigger cosmic human problem, of how we as human beings relate to the universe we find ourselves in. I think there's a better way. This is me being weird, I suppose, but I think there's a better way for human beings to do what we do, because I think the humans are a very special sort of thing, and a lot of people are very disparaging about humanity. You'll see people like, well, if all the humans went extinct, everything would be great, And I don't think that's necessarily true. That would solve a lot of problems for certain aspects of the environment and so on, but I think there is a reason why we exist. And I think we haven't quite figured out what that reason is, but we do something that, as far as we know, no other animal or living creature can do. And like, I was thinking about this last night when I was watching those bands play, and then when Zero Defects played. if you found if you could put a group of orangutans on stage and have them do anything close, to drop the A-bomb on me or anything, even the simplest song in the world, you'd just be amazed. Look at the level of cooperation those animals are able to coordinate with each other and produce something out of it. And we have this special ability to do that. And I think that special ability, this is me being wildly speculative, but I think it's something that nature may want, if nature can be said to have wanted things. And to me it seems like a continuation of a pattern that happens within nature as far as we know. Because it started out with these single-celled organisms who were basically all in it for themselves, who eventually sort of cooperated in colonies of single-celled organisms, and then those colonies sort of fused into, multi-celled creatures, and those creatures eventually evolved into, communities of creatures, and now nature has coughed up something after millions of years of trial and error or whatever that can coordinate with other members of its species to a really, really high degree. And I think that's amazing, and I think there is probably a reason for that. And like I say, I don't like to speculate, but I think there's probably a reason that has happened. The same as, there's a reason that this multicellular organisms billions of years ago started. And what we could do with that ability that we already possess could be incredible, and this is why I love to read science fiction, and speculate about, what could happen to a civilization who was at the stage we're at 1 million years ago. I mean, what would that civilization look like if they could, overcome the hump of destroying themselves, which I imagine. Sorry, I love speculating like this, so I'll just do it. I imagine that once we are able to travel the universe and start seeing what's out there, my guess is we will find a lot of dead civilizations. This is just my guess, and we'll see if I'm right. But I imagine that once we have the technology to see what's in outer space, we will find planets on which there clearly was a civilization that destroyed itself. And hopefully we won't be one of those. But my guess is that's probably what happens to most civilizations who get as far as we do. And we have to be very, very careful at this juncture in our evolution that we don't do that, because we still might do that. But I think if we can manage to get past that, there are things we could do. We could potentially solve the environmental problems and get things back into the balance they should be in, and so forth and so on. There's all sorts of things, but I don't think, my guess it'll be if that happens, it'll be 1,000 years or 20,000 years. It's not going to happen. Everybody's thinking, yeah, we're going to fix all these problems, and I'm going, you're probably not going to. But it's good if we lay the seeds, to that for future generations that may be able to see where we went wrong in our attempts to do that. And I like to be optimistic, about that, about the prospect. So, sorry for my soapbox thing there.
Well, on that note, probably if you see what time it is.
Oh, yeah.
And if people would like to come up and say hi in person and maybe purchase a book, or
I would love to sell some of these books because I don't want to carry them back.
So first of all, let's just thank you, Brad.